Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Flamingo's Resident Experience and Engagement podcast. I'm so excited today because we have Elizabeth Williams, the Director of Marketing at Tricap Residential. So got connected with Elizabeth because she was actually a reference for someone that we recently hired. And we got into a really good conversation, and she mentioned a few things that I thought would be really beneficial for listeners, especially around resident engagement. So at TriCap, instead of property managers, they actually have engagement managers. And I'll let Elizabeth kind of talk more about that in a few minutes. But Elizabeth, welcome. So as a quick overview, she is currently the Director of Marketing at TriCap Residential Group. She's based out of Chicago. Previously was the VP of Marketing at Newcastle, also known as Reside Living. So Elizabeth, welcome to our latest episode.
Thanks, Jude. Happy to be here.
Okay, great. So I'll kind of start with where I always start, which is like what got you into property management? Because you've definitely been in the industry for a little bit of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you blink and you can say you've been doing this for 15 years, but I feel like I'm 15 sometimes.
Nice.
My industry story is kind of funny. It's super totally fell into it. I know you probably hear that a lot. That's something that's so great about our industry. I native of Colorado. I moved here right out of college. Well, a year after college, after CU Boulder. And my boyfriend at the time, I ended up marrying him, got into law school here in Chicago and in other places. And he in other cities. And I just kind of had my head in the clouds. Like, I don't really know what I want to do. We could dive into like the pressure we put on 18-year-olds when they leave the nest and have to choose, their career path. So funny enough, I'm actually a international affairs major. So that's like econ. It's like econ and poli-sci. And I just I think seeing him take the LSATs and get ready for life as an attorney, it just wasn't my thing. And my family has a real estate background. My mom has been in the mortgage industry since she moved to Colorado in the 70s. And my dad had his own renovation contract business. So I was always around real estate. My favorite aunt and uncle bought up a bunch of great real estate in Colorado that are now like some of the most sought after neighborhoods. They saw potential in those neighborhoods. So it's not that surprising that I fell into it, but we were looking at apartments in San Francisco, Chicago, and eventually we would have headed to New York. We knew we wanted to live in a big city, and 5 years, whatever, and we just fell in love with Chicago. So we were looking at apartments. This is 2006. And it was still kind of old school, Jude. You made your list and you called and you made appointments. How we have evolved, which I know you and I will go into further. I mean, my God, have we evolved? Thank goodness. But we went into this old building from. I, of course, fell in love with the idea of living in an old historic high rise because they don't really exist in Denver. There's low rise buildings downtown, but they weren't necessarily residential. And the name of the building is the Fisher Building. And it's a Daniel Burnham building. So I actually had worked for an architect a little bit in college. And he always talked about Daniel Burnham. So it was totally above our price range. And just by total happenstance, the regional at Village Green happened to be covering the site over the weekend because her property manager, leasing consultant, they all got the flu. So so she happened to be there, and she asked me, well, what are you going to do? And I had saved enough money for us to, cover rent for a couple of months. I had a ton of interviews scheduled here in Chicago. And she was like, well, we just started construction on a lease up that's about 4 blocks away from here called MDA City
Mhm.
Apartments.
Oh
Have you
wow,
ever
know
have
that
you
one as
ever
well.
done yeah, have you ever done leasing? And I was like, no.
I
She, she was like, you kind of have a good personality for this. So I went home, applied, they called me, I interviewed with people. So kind of similar today, had
yeah
virtual interviews, except they were all over the phone and not via Zoom.
yeah.
And they were like, yeah, we want to take a chance on you. And I was at Village Green for almost 9.5 years. I gave them my
Wow.
20s, as I say. It
Mhm.
was the best. Loved the experience and moved up pretty quickly. Yeah, so that's my multifamily inception story.
Wow. I feel like I hear that a lot where no
Mm-hmm.
one graduates from college and it's like, yeah, I'm gonna go into the real estate or the property management industry. It's always by accident. I know
Yeah.
I've spoken with at least two people who have something very similar. Either they were looking for an apartment or something else, and someone on site was like, "Hey, you have a good personality. I think you can do this. You're very much of a people person. And what do you know about leasing?"
And you're like, not much, but I'll figure it out.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
I and now there's schools that have property management
Hmm.
degrees, which is really cool. Like Ball State is one of
Yeah.
them. Uh, they have
Hmm.
a phenomenal program. So as I moved up in my career, HR and hiring managers were
Hmm.
definitely targeting the school. Like, could you imagine you get somebody that already knows what NOI
Yeah.
is and like
Yep.
ROI, like every acronym in our world, they already
Yep.
have a some sort of semblance of what that is and can apply it.
Yep.
But that doesn't. What I love about this industry is that it goes back to what you said. There's something about a personality. There is a
Hmm.
gut feeling, and it's more based on your innate skills versus
Hmm.
what you ultimately will learn. I think
Yeah.
that's just in my experience and the growth that I've had in this industry, and I've been pretty loyal to 3 companies
Hmm.
in that span, just because
Yep.
my brain's like a sponge. I just learn about the company, learn about the brand, and just take it all in. And
Hmm.
the marketing side definitely was where I knew I wanted to stay on that
Hmm.
path. So I guess one of my biggest my advice to the listeners that are either new in
Hmm.
this industry or maybe just feel stuck in the role that they're in, the opportunities in multifamily, when you think about
Yep.
all the different roles on site in corporate,
Hmm.
we have communications, we have marketing, we have PR, we have obviously anything on the service team, and the skills needed for different levels there. The financial side, the accounting side, there are so many different, like, there are major companies that only do one of those things. We're in an
Yeah.
industry where you can kind of test the waters of many different types of things to see what you're good at. I just knew
Yeah.
the operations, in the traditional sense, which is I'm excited for us to
Hmm.
jump into the distinctions that Tricap has made for our people. Uh,
Yeah.
like the traditional property manager, Jude, of the day, back in the day, and still exists
Hmm.
today, was not something that appealed to me.
Yeah. So kind of interesting then you started off in the leasing side
Mm-hmm.
and then completely moved up to marketing. So what about the operation side or what about like the yeah, just like the more operational side did not appeal to you?
I would say Village Green was pretty progressive at the time.
Hmm.
There were opportunities to continue growing on the sales
Hmm.
side that ultimately the sales, call it pipeline, always led
Hmm.
into the marketing and communications department. And I totally agree with that. There's a different mindset. They call it attracting prospects
Hmm.
versus that fight to keep a
Keep
resident.
them.
Yes,
Yep.
there is that dichotomy definitely exists, and
Hmm.
I didn't want to an upset resident because
Hmm.
they haven't paid their rent. And, I'm a highly empathetic person, but
Yeah.
I maybe too empathetic where you need to,
uh,
lay down the law a little bit and be like,
yeah.
we've got to be fair to everyone. You need to pay. So my operations experience, I would say, Jude, would be that I'm a very observant person. Like I told you, my brain, I don't know, I soak up a lot of
Hmm.
facts, and who knows, half the time they're useless. But I listened and observed because I really cared about either if I was on site or even corporate, just getting that
Hmm.
full context. So sure, were there times I had to step in and, put on an operations hat, let's say a
Hmm.
property manager. And again, in the old school model, typically leasing report, the property manager is the GM. They're the general manager of the
Hmm.
entire business. Uh, Service reports to them. They're the boss. Where,
Hmm.
the industry is evolving, and I happen to be at a phenomenal place right now that is just, they get that, and they've got
Yeah.
people in the right seats. So
Yeah, so I'd love to go a little bit more in depth on that. So you left Village Green and then went to reside, also known as
mhm,
Newcastle, and now you are at Tricap, and very different model for how the
mhm.
teams are constructed. Yeah, we'd love to know more about that. So from the engagement manager to what other roles they have and how that differs than what you've seen at other companies and at your previous companies.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. So funny enough, today is my 1 year anniversary at TriCap.
Oh,
So
congrats.
kind of ironic. And I'd
Oh, so you
spoken,
started in the middle of the pandemic.
I did.
Wow.
And that's a whole other podcast. But it's gotten good. I mean, we've got
Hmm.
onboarding virtually down pretty packed,
Hmm.
I would say. But what was so intriguing was, one, it starts with our founder and CEO, Brian Pritchard. He's
Hmm.
forward thinking. He's very entrepreneurial thinking as well. And that traditional model of what we just talked about, you've got the property manager and then the
Hmm.
teams that funnel down, and that that pressure to put on a property manager to be an expert in all those things, because that does come with,
Hmm.
if you're going to be the boss of somebody, you need to know enough to be dangerous, right? Which I totally agree. I
Yep.
think you need to be aware of what your team is doing and what even your colleagues are
Hmm.
doing, which is something I just alluded to that I personally do, because I think it gives you a well-rounded picture of what's happening at a property.
Hmm.
However, pre-pandemic, the leadership team at TriCap, they wanted to flip the script on multifamily. Brian's not your typical CEO. And again, I'm going to speak in generalities because I know I've worked for some really cool CEOs too
Hmm.
that are forward thinking and definitely have their
Yeah.
finger on the pulse. But Brian, he really does listen to his team. Yeah, he's at the top of the food chain, you could say, right? But
Hmm.
he really listens to his team and lets us deploy these kind of
Yeah.
crazy ideas. Well, they're perceived as kind of crazy from others that are
Yeah.
stuck in their ways in the old traditional multifamily way, which is what we just talked about. And the
Hmm.
thinking became, the more and more the technology is finally caught up to multifamily, and you
Hmm.
sink or swim. And I mean,
Yeah.
you started an app. I mean, like
Yeah.
this, it's like we need these things because the audience, our prospects and residents,
Hmm.
they want to work with a company that is modern and has the stuff
Hmm.
so that so their lives are easier, right?
Yeah.
So pre-pandemic, the decision was made. They saw how stressed out property managers were. So
Mm.
TriCap a year and a half ago was in a more traditional model where there was a property manager, some leasing agents, and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. And the property manager was always the most wound up, stressed, working
Yeah.
crazy hours. We make them be HR. They've had to do pay. I mean, just think all the
Hmm.
tasks that a property manager has to do. It's inevitable that they tend to be the ones that burn out the fastest.
Yeah.
They tend to be the most unhappy. So
Yeah.
the thinking was Brian brought together some of the best from all the best companies in multifamily, but
Oh,
had
wow.
that he did. Like my boss, for example, her name's Suzanne Hobson. She's a
Hmm.
multifamily, her crazy good reputation. She was even at uh, a training module that we all
Hmm.
use called Grace Hill. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I'm
I,
familiar with Grace Hill. Yep.
yeah. So she just imagine, the feedback that she had been on, even on the vendor side, but also
Hmm.
was a VP in many, many wonderful companies, including Marquette.
Hmm.
Again, a more modern multifamily company. So, long story short, the thinking was, well, let's recreate the roles. Let's have there be hyper focus on the customer. And therefore, the customer cycle was evaluated. So you've got the initial customer, which is the prospect, and then you've got the resident. So
Hmm.
we don't call them leasing consultants. We started a role called sales managers, and they own the sales portion of of the customer life cycle. So they
Yeah.
do a kick-ass job getting these people
Hmm.
loving the property, albeit virtually too, which we can dive into, which is really
Wow.
hard to do.
Yeah.
And then they hand it over to the engagement manager. And the service team where they mix in is there's a service manager.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's pretty ingenious. So everyone has their hyper focus, and then we are an EOS company, so we host. They're called L10 meetings, where
Hmm.
we joke around. It's cuss and discuss. They meet enough where kind of those broad general things, but they all affect each other, like a market
Hmm.
ready. The salesperson needs a market ready, the engagement manager needs the apartment to look good so that when they make that
Yeah.
introduction to the community in Tricap, that you start on the right foot with the move in.
Hmm.
And yeah, then service, obviously that puts a lot of pressure on them to make sure that the product look good. And that's just one
Yeah.
example of how they need to meet very frequently to make sure that everyone's on the same page. They're actually called same page
Hmm.
meetings too.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's full transparency. Our number one core value is trust first. We have to.
Hmm.
And if you can't, then you got to go,
Yeah.
because we have to trust that our team members are going to do their hyper focused, their department and their
Hmm.
responsibilities, they're theirs. So when you think about that, that totally flips the script. Where think about a property manager in the traditional sense would be in charge of making sure the leasing consultant had enough appointments for
Hmm.
the week. The leasing consultant, was dressed appropriately for tours, had a good closing ratio, all those things. And then
Yeah.
their own job, the property managers typically manage renewals as well. Maybe if they had an
Hmm.
assistant manager, they would handle that. AR, so accounts receivable, and then
Yeah.
dealing with the service and maintenance teams, making sure, walking the property, making sure it looks good. That was all on the property manager. So now that we've segmented it and everybody has their hyper
Hmm.
focus, sales is sales. There's a director of sales.
Hmm.
Engagement, there's a director of engagement to ensure that those policies and procedures and accountabilities are
Hmm.
being managed well, and the person's happy and they have the
Yeah.
capacity to. And then there's the service team, and then there's a director of service, and then there's the service managers I alluded to. And they have this phenomenal transparency amongst each other, but they're colleagues.
Hmm.
There isn't that pressure to be the big, I'll never forget, there would be meetings where only with like if it was a third party management contract, like at
Hmm.
Village Green, and the asset manager from some massive bank, right, would come into
Yeah.
town, only the property manager and the corporate team, and the poor property
Hmm.
manager would have to explain, every discrepancy
Yeah.
on the books and the product. I mean, just every P, like the 4 Ps: people, price, product,
Yeah.
and promotion. That person was responsible to respond to somebody. That's a lot.
Wow. It's a lot. And you're absolutely right. Like just talking to property managers, looking at property manager groups, the level of stress on a property manager or anyone in the industry is just so absurd. And they have pressure from the resident side of things. They have pressure from the corporate side of things. They have pressure from the asset manager or the owner. Just like all condensing on them, like from all directions.
Yep. So no
So I'm
thanks.
curious for those like, yeah,
Doesn't sound
absolutely.
super appealing for a career path.
No, and that's why from last I looked at the turnover in the industry, I think it's right now at least 30%. Like it is high. It is a high turnover. So at Tricap, so looking at those like three segments, so like sales, engagement, and service, where does the typical property manager fall into that? So I assume like on the engagement side.
Yes.
So for your engagement managers, like what are they responsible for?
So that handoff, so making that move in
Hmm.
day great. But
Hmm.
any issues that arise, so if noise
Hmm.
complaints still happen, and everybody was at home this last year, so some neighbors had to
Yeah.
get used to seeing their neighbors more.
Yep.
And but they do not do AR. We have an AR manager,
Hmm.
and she's the bomb. She's
Oh,
amazing. So
wow.
she handles the delinquencies and
Hmm.
any of the notices for lack of
Hmm.
payment. So they don't do that. So engagement truly is engaging with their residents. So they're responsible for communicating to their resident. And it's not just, hey, the
Hmm.
water's going to be shut off at 2 today.
Hmm.
They have to be more creative, where that's where I
Yep.
help them to step in, give them some kind of cool designs to put on their portal,
Hmm.
help them with some messaging if they're struggling with what they need to say or how to say it.
Hmm.
And then when notices, so they do handle the renewals, and they start those conversations months before somebody comes up for renewal. They actually, our
Hmm.
residents get a survey from Satisfax. It's a pre-renewal survey, and it's to gauge like
Hmm.
how likely are you going to renew.
Yeah.
And that is something our engagement managers live by. So unless a person decides to be anonymous, which they can, then you're
Hmm.
like, I have a feeling it's so and so. But so then
Yeah.
they engage with their people coming up on notice. And then there's kind of the interview. Like if somebody does give notice, what could we have done
Hmm.
differently? Why?
Yeah.
Obviously, you would start with why are you moving? And they, if there is something that we did or could have done better, and it's usually just due
Hmm.
to lack of communication, the person was upset but didn't really say anything, or maybe they
Yeah.
went on Google or apartment ratings and stayed anonymous and just said,
Hmm.
you know, I don't know,
This place
X
sucks.
property sucks. Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
when you have that, anonymity, you choose to, it's
Hmm.
more of eventing,
Yeah.
right? And you're not really wanting a solution. It gives the engagement
Hmm.
managers an opportunity to engage this person to
Hmm.
fix their issues. Most of 90% of the stuff is totally fixable. It's a breakdown
Yeah.
in communication. They had something broken in their apartment but didn't put in a work order. They didn't like
Hmm.
their neighbor. It's like, okay, we'll transfer you. Well, let's go to the other
Yeah.
side of the property. So
Yeah.
it's funny, engagement, they should almost be called communication managers too.
Communication. It's
Mm-hmm.
so funny you say that. So for us, we look at so much data on our platform, on different parts where residents like interact, whether it's Google reviews, Facebook reviews, and then internally as well. And of all the analysis we've done, we found that like in 75 to like 90% of situations, every issue is a communication issue. Like you just said, the resident thought they put in a work order, but it actually did not. Or the resident wanted something, but maybe they didn't emphasize it enough, so they're unhappy but never expressed it. Or the property manager, they said X, but the resident like heard like Y. And when we
Totally.
look at like the properties that have like the highest resident satisfaction scores, one of the things that shot up to the top of the list immediately was over communication. So how many emails the site team sent out to residents? Properties that send two plus per week had the highest resident satisfactions versus the ones that send out communication maybe like once a month or a little bit less. And it's very, very, very clear. And I think for property managers, some of them think that they are annoy residents with over communication, which is like absolutely not the case at all. Because half the time people are like, oh, I didn't get that email. And it's because they actually did not. So you really have to overdo it.
Yeah, agreed. And on
Yeah. So
multiple
it's very
channels.
interesting that you guys have found that. Yeah. So looking at the results then, what have been some of the initial results you guys have seen? And how long how long since you guys made this change?
So they were officially in new seats in September of
Hmm.
2020. So not even a
Yeah.
year yet. And
Hmm.
the biggest result that's measurable is our turnover.
Hmm.
We've had I think we've had two engagement managers turnover, and one you know, good problem. People have children.
Hmm.
So,
Okay.
so it was like, it wasn't, because of the role. Hopefully they come
Yeah.
back. And then the second was funny, a teacher initially and wants to go back
Hmm.
to that possibly,
Hmm.
but is interested in the for sale side. So the conversation almost turned to, well, do you want to go to sales manager?
Yeah.
Because again, their colleagues, their peer level, their sales managers and engagement managers
Hmm.
are the same.
Hmm.
So
Oh, wow.
I think in our industry too, there's this perception. I remember being pressured, like, well, if you ever want to move up to corporate, you've got to
Hmm.
become an assistant manager, then a manager, then a regional. But no, when I knew that marketing and sales was my path, uh,
Hmm.
Village Green at the time was my employer. They adjusted to that and they created a phenomenal growth plan for the sales
Yeah.
team so that they didn't have to go over to the operation side. And that's
Hmm.
still the case today there. It's pretty spectacular. So again, you just have to find the right company that has those various paths. And sometimes you don't know that something's not a fit until
Hmm.
you're burnt out.
Yeah.
We use a company called Culture Index here, and
Hmm.
there's a line where your battery, you're using up too much battery to get something pretty basic done.
Hmm.
It's an indicator that it's too much. You're doing the job, but you don't.
Yeah.
It's taking every bit of you to do it because you're not in the
Yeah.
right seat. And that can vary
Yeah.
throughout the year. We all have different times of the year where it's super stressful. So, you know, you're going through hyper growth. So for us, our
Hmm.
acquisitions team, they're busy. They're probably really
Yeah.
stressed out. And this would be a good time to see, like, but is their battery running low?
Hmm.
Because they're like maybe considering, like, am I doing the right thing? So we're
Yeah.
fortunate enough to be at a company where we test throughout the year, and we don't have just one year evaluation. We are evaluated with our supervisors every
Hmm.
quarter, and the
Oh,
conversations
wow.
are actually really cool. It's not, you're for like the sales team, you're not hyper focused on closing ratios, because
Hmm.
that's so arbitrary to say, because everybody's properties are different and they're
Hmm.
different markets and they're at different states throughout the year. They could be, you might have two tours at a property if they're 99% occupied. Like, you're not
Yeah.
driving traffic to something you don't need to, right? And
Yeah.
then on the engagement side, they are definitely held responsible for
Hmm.
those engagement scores related to surveys and resident satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, as the director of marketing and communications, I oversee our reputation as a whole. So
Yeah.
long story short, it takes a village. I know it's a
Yeah.
cliche,
No,
but
absolutely agree.
nobody's alone in what they do,
Yeah.
even though they have hyper focused job
Mm-hmm.
responsibilities that don't require them to wear. I hate that. Like, oh,
Wear many
multifamily
hats.
property managers wear so many hats. Like,
Yeah. And
it's
it
funny.
really doesn't have to be like that.
And hire somebody who thinks that they need to lead it like into a conversation like I'm able to multitask. That's a red flag
Mm-hmm.
actually to us at Tricap. That means that their battery is low. They're not
Mm-hmm.
able to do one thing very well. They have to
Mm-hmm.
do a lot of things so.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting and something that I've really become a strong advocate for is resident experience is really, really important, but staff experience is also so important. Like if
Mhm.
your site teams or even your corporate teams are, if they don't have the best experience, if they are burned out, if they are stressed out, that's going to translate directly to what your resident experience feels like from the resident side. So all of those things are so connected in so many different ways. So it's so cool to see that you guys are really bringing the staff experience up to the same level where everyone else is right now just focused on the resident side of the experience.
And there's a
So
lot.
outside of like, oh yeah, so outside of like turnover, like have you guys done any like surveys with your teams to see like what their experience is, how things have changed with this new focus, and what does that look like?
Oh yeah. We host State of the Companies
Hmm.
once a quarter, and we host town halls where it's just an open
Hmm.
forum. And our most recent one, really, we did hone in on this was a crazy cool idea, but that doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily mean every facet of the change that we made in September is
Yeah.
working. And what I love about TriCap is that we have this, we're sitting in a town hall with our CEO and he's
Hmm.
taking in all of this, and there's a retribution. People
Yeah.
can be open and honest about what's working and what's not and what's the solution. And then we fix it. We fix it as a team. Is it a market specific thing that's
Hmm.
frustrating that person in their seat? With it being
Hmm.
virtual. So sales and engagement are 100% virtual. So our only boots on the ground are the service team. So we really got to take care of our
Wow.
service team because they're
Yeah, the
the,
face.
so with the resident, they go in to do a work order. If you, and a lot of us that have worked on site, you end up
Hmm.
becoming like a therapist too. Then they tell you like,
Hmm.
they tell you what's going on. And especially during COVID, people, they craved like human interaction. So our service team, it would take
Hmm.
them a little bit longer to do work orders because, well, they wanted to give good customer service. So then they get
Yeah.
behind. So not everything worked out perfectly, and not every market is totally appropriate for our structure. And that is something that we're
Hmm.
working on. But at least we're not, so we're not stuck. We're like, funny enough, we don't stick maybe long enough. Sometimes we pivot fast.
Yeah.
And if you're
Yeah.
not good with change, then TriCap is definitely not the company for you.
Hmm.
We are testing different things all the time, and we're pivoting all the time to make sure that our
Yeah.
teams are happy and our residents, first and foremost, the customers are happy.
Hmm.
And the surveys that we do internally and externally, some of the markets that when we did this, I think they assumed it was only for COVID because
Hmm.
everybody was at home, right? So there are some markets that in resident, we call it tapestry. They're they
Yeah.
they have always rented in the traditional model where you you're ticked off, you storm down to the office, right? And
Hmm.
that's just what we talked about. We know that isn't productive from a communication standpoint.
Hmm.
It's lay out the issue first. Maybe that's via email. Maybe that's through a work order. And then let the conversations, it's almost like the resident needs to just get it out and they feel a little bit better. They
have a
it's
period to like cool off a
yes.
little bit.
So it's call it, it's a cathartic experience for them. But those poor property managers in the traditional setup were getting yelled at a lot. And that's hard to, that takes an emotional and physical toll on people. And for what? We're not saving lives here. It's customer service experience. And so they've gotten really good at giving a good customer service experience, albeit virtual. They can hop on a Zoom call with a resident, and they do all the time. We use a service called Whereby Rooms so that nobody has to download apps or anything. And then internally, we use Microsoft Teams so they can also use that. But it's and platforms like Flamingo, like you can communicate. There is a way. What we have to make sure that our teams feel supported is that they don't get stuck in getting lost in translation. So those communication skills need to be really on point, especially email communications. You can totally mean something else, but you said the opposite and you didn't mean to.
So then I'm curious, you've touched on a lot of really interesting things from the staff burnout, the stress, communication to really how property managers or property management companies need to constantly like pivot, which are all things that I completely agree with. So for Tricap, like when you guys are looking at the end goal, what are the goals you guys are aiming for? Is it decreasing like turnover, just making renewals much better? Is it resident satisfaction? Is it reviews? If you had to rank from like 1 to 3, which are like the top 3 metrics that you guys look at to see that this is working?
Definitely resident satisfaction, because then it just trickles down. Your residents are happy, your engagement managers are happy, your service team is happy, because you just have that, perfect flow amongst all the, parties involved. And right now, like I alluded to earlier, we are on a hyper growth mode. So we do want to retain people and grow them and have, engagement manager experts. We just promoted a couple of people on the sales and engagement side to senior. They're willing to step in on those pivot projects, as we call them. Like they want to beta test new software and new things. And they're also seen as a team member within, their bucket that everyone seems to look up to. And they've got the skills. They've kind of done it all. They're very relatable and approachable to their team members. So obviously retention, but within that retention, growth for the team members. We're a small company today, but that won't be the case in 5 years. So build people now that get it, are in, they love it. They hate to say it, they drink the Kool-Aid, but they're deploying the core values at Tricap, one being trust first. There are other ones, but the trust first is a big one. To be able to be virtual and be like, all right, team member, I know you've got that portion of it. There's something kind of freeing about it. And sure, do people disappoint sometimes? And you thought you could trust them. But what we try to do internally is just keep building that, I hate to say it again, but the trust where, okay, like that situation, it happened. That doesn't mean you necessarily can't trust that person. And if enough of those situations happen, then we know that they're not a culture fit. If somebody has a reputation that their other team members can't trust them, got to go. And what that means is that the residents don't trust them. So really, it's funny. The resident communication portion tells so many more stories than just about the 4 walls that they live in. It tells the story about how we're doing in this virtual, setup that we have at Tricap. and how we're failing our team members, especially, again, our service team members carrying the brunt of that in-person customer service interaction.
Oh, love that. And I think one thing that everyone should really like note is all of what you've mentioned, especially related to staff experience, that ends up driving things a lot further down the line. So as you have lower turnover, one of the biggest complaints we've also seen is residents hate when the site team turns over. It's like all new people, nothing they know, and it's just that constant change just irritates residents so much. So I love this approach of focusing on staff experience, constantly pivoting to see what's working, what's not, and then making a change. Because as you know, like real estate is known to be one of those industries where things just like don't change quickly. It
Right.
takes a lot to move anything. So love the approach that you guys like take.
Yeah, and
So I always
Jude, I
end with
also want to mention real quick too before we end.
Mhm.
The surveying, I forgot to mention, we survey our team members once a week. So
Oh
we
wow.
use Tiny Pulse, which is it's
Hmm.
not, most of our residents, so they fill out surveys. It's at least 5 to 10 questions where they can give a little more context than just yes or no.
Yep.
But we do it's taking a pulse. Like
Yep.
last week, we got a survey: is leadership aware of the struggles on site? And when we mean on site,
Hmm.
virtually on site. And
Hmm.
it's just as simple as that. So you might get something no, and then we're able to respond
Hmm.
anonymously and say, "What's up? Well, let's talk."
Yep.
We don't just take the no and it gets dumped into a chart where somebody said
Yeah.
no and it gives us a negative score. We're definitely trying to squeeze out the context to really get to
Hmm.
the root of the problem and therefore fix it. Sometimes people are just in the wrong seat. They're a culture fit,
Yep.
but they want to go. Maybe they should try sales because
Yep.
the pressure of being an engagement manager. And yes, it's usually the people are upset
Hmm.
or and oh yeah, you just increased their rent.
Yep.
Yeah. So just wanted to notate that too. I definitely recommend to the listeners. There's simple tools, even
Yep.
like Survey Monkey has a free tool where you could just get a
Hmm.
pulse from your employees. It's interesting what you'll find
Yep.
out.
I absolutely love that. And that's one of the things we recommend, not just for staff, but for residents as well. I think one thing that a lot of properties do, they do surveys, but typically the surveys are like once every 6 months or once a year. We absolutely recommend pulse surveys, which is what you were referring to, is get a pulse on your residents like every month. Not everyone's going to complete the surveys, but at least you've given that opportunity for them to say, hey, I don't, things are not going well for me right now, or things are going phenomenally. And what that allows you to do is to really track things over time and see if any initiatives, changes, pivots that you do are impacting the overall like resident sentiment. So definitely cannot recommend pulse surveys enough. It's just like such a simple way, and you learn so much. And the best part is that it gives residents an opportunity to air things out before they take it to Google reviews, Facebook reviews, Yelp reviews. So those places where you can't change anything. Yeah, so love it. So I always end with, what do you see in terms of resident experience or engagement 3, 5, 10 years from now? What are some of your predictions?
Oh, I mean, I think the days of pizza parties by the pool are
Hmm.
kind of over. I think if
Hmm.
the in-person stuff, which it's coming back, and we're even starting to
Hmm.
do that, they've got to be really great and
Yep.
like maybe even sponsored. I mean, I'm thinking
Yeah.
residents, they they want to be impressed. So I think people are going to have to
Hmm.
up their in-person game. But I
Yep.
think virtual needs it's. I think it's here to stay. So people got
Hmm.
used to it during the pandemic. When I was at Newcastle Reside, we already had been doing it. Like
Yep.
they were doing online cooking classes pre-pandemic that were highly attended. They were so cool. I just think that virtual experience is going to get fine-tuned. I think it's going to
Hmm.
become the norm. And I
Yep.
don't think it's going to go back, with the exception of, again, like a blowout party because it's sponsored
Hmm.
by, I don't know,
Yep.
like a cool brand.
A few
I
cities.
think
Yeah.
people, totally, like I don't,
Yep.
that's my prediction.
No, I love that, and I absolutely agree. I think we will see a shift from resident events to resident experiences. So it's really how do
Nailed
you
it.
create an experience? Yep. And that's exactly what people are looking for. And I love the aspect that you mentioned of getting sponsors. So properties have this incredible asset called
Yeah.
their residents. They need to utilize it. There are a lot of brands that want to be in front of those people. And the second part is properties have all the things you need for experiences. They have amazing event spaces. So I think we're going to see a lot more of those. And then on the leasing side, I think we're going to see a lot more prospect-based events. So why have an event and invite the whole neighborhood?
Right.
That's free tours, that's free
So
foot
cool.
traffic, just free branding, just like so many things. And then you add PR on top of that, and now you have XYZ magazine like writing about your building and all the cool events that you guys like do. So I think we'll see a lot more of those. And that
Agreed.
just plays into a lot of what you've said, which is that a lot of what property managers do has to be segmented because in order to pull off something like that, you need someone whose specific job is that. You can't just like add that on to your property manager to say, hey, we need you to do this as well. Reach out to sponsors, get sponsors.
They're not event planners. There's people that go
Yep,
to school
yep,
for that. We definitely know. And
yep,
yeah, and they
yep.
don't, they're going to resent it, and it's not going to be done as well as
Hmm.
somebody that has the capacity to do it and wants to
Yep,
do it.
yep, exactly. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being on our podcast. I think this was phenomenal. I learned a lot. I'm so happy to see that there is a company out there that's so focused on staff experience because at the end of the day, that matters just as much as your resident experience.
For sure.
Yeah. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jude. This is
Yeah.
great.